It's December 1776. The American Revolution is basically over. At least, that's what the British think. That's what half of America thinks. Enlistments are expiring, men are deserting. The Continental Army is freezing, starving, and falling apart at the seams. And yet, here we are, standing on the banks of the Delaware River in the dead of night, in a blizzard, about to do something that most military minds would call suicidal. My name doesn't matter much. I'm one soldier among 2,400. But I was there. I saw what happened. And I want to tell you exactly what that night felt like. Not the version you read in history books, not the cleaned-up painting you've seen 1,000 times. The real version. The cold, the fear, the doubt, and the moment when something shifted. Because here's the thing most people don't realize about that crossing. It wasn't heroic at the start. It was desperate. There's a difference, and understanding that difference is what makes what happened next so remarkable. So let me take you back, all the way back to how we even got to that river in the first place. You need to understand the context before you can understand the crossing. By December 1776, the Continental Army had been getting beaten, badly. New York had been a disaster. Washington had lost Long Island in August in a battle that should have ended the war right there. The British General Howe had over 32,000 troops, including those fearsome Hessian mercenaries hired from the German states. Washington had maybe 20,000 men at his peak, many of them poorly trained, poorly equipped, and serving on short-term enlistments. We lost Brooklyn. We lost Manhattan. We retreated through New Jersey with the British nipping at our heels the whole way. Town after town, we just kept falling back. Newark, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton. The British were methodical about it, and we were exhausted. Think about what that does to morale. You sign up to fight for independence, for this grand idea, and then you spend weeks just running away. Men started to wonder, are we actually going to win this? Or are we just prolonging the inevitable? Thomas Paine was marching with us during part of that retreat, and he started writing by firelight. Those words became the American crisis. You probably know the opening. These are the times that try men's souls. That wasn't just rhetoric. He was describing exactly what we were living through every single day. By the time we crossed into Pennsylvania in early December, crossing the Delaware the first time, going west to get away from the British, our numbers had shrunk dramatically. Some estimates put Washington's effective fighting force at around 3,000 men. Some say fewer. Against a well-supplied professional army that had just swept through New Jersey, almost unopposed. And here's what made it even worse. December 31st was coming. That was the date most enlistments expired. If Washington couldn't do something, anything before that date, his army would simply walk home. Legally, there would be nothing left to command. The revolution would be over. Not with a dramatic final battle. Just with men quietly going home because their paperwork said they could. General Howe, comfortable in New York, didn't even think it was worth chasing us anymore. He put his troops into winter quarters, a string of garrison posts across New Jersey, and basically waited for spring. He figured the cold and time would finish us off. He was probably right, but he made one miscalculation. He underestimated how desperate Washington had become. And desperate men sometimes do things that reasonable men never would. Washington didn't stumble into the idea of crossing back over the Delaware. He thought about it carefully, talked to his officers, weighed the risks, and the risks were enormous. The plan was to cross the river on the night of December 25th, Christmas night, when the Hessian garrison at Trenton would presumably be celebrating. Maybe drunk, definitely not expecting an attack. 3 separate groups would cross at different points. Washington would lead the main force, about 2,400 men, crossing at McConkey's Ferry about 9 miles north of Trenton. Two other groups would cross further south to cut off retreat and support the main attack. The target was the Hessian garrison at Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rahl. About 1,400 Hessian soldiers, well-trained, well-armed, sitting in a town they'd occupied for weeks. The goal wasn't just to win a battle. Washington needed a victory, a real, tangible, documented victory, to show the Continental Congress, to show the French who might help us, to show the men whose enlistments were about to expire, that this revolution wasn't dead, that it was worth staying for. That's the weight that sits on a military operation like this. It's not just tactical, it's psychological, it's political. Everything, in a very real sense, depends on what happens in the next 24 hours. I remember hearing fragments of this plan filtered down through the ranks. We weren't told everything, of course. Common soldiers rarely are. But word travels in an army, even a ragged one. You hear things around fires, overhear officers talking, piece together what's happening from the orders you're given. And when I started to understand what we were being asked to do, cross a half-frozen river at night, in winter, in secret, then march 9 miles and attack a fortified position at dawn, my first honest reaction was not inspiration. It was something much closer to dread. The day itself was strange, quiet. We knew something was coming, the orders to prepare, to draw rations, to check weapons. It all pointed toward action, but no one said exactly when or exactly what. So we waited. Christmas in the army is different from Christmas at home. There's no warmth to it, no family. The men who had families were thinking about them. You could see it on their faces. Some men were praying quietly. Some were just staring at nothing. The weather had been bad for days. Cold, wet, miserable. And as the day went on, it got worse. The wind picked up. Clouds moved in heavy and low. By afternoon you could smell snow coming, that particular sharpness in the air that anyone who spent time outdoors knows immediately. Around mid-afternoon, the orders came. We were moving. Tonight. Prepare your equipment, check your flints, wrap your feet if you need to. And many of us did, because our shoes were gone or falling apart. Some men literally had rags wrapped around their feet, not for warmth, just to have something between skin and frozen ground. We started moving toward the river as darkness fell. 2,400 men, plus artillery, 18 cannons that Henry Knox had organized, and that would prove absolutely critical. Moving quietly, trying to look like less than we were, trying not to make a sound that would carry across the water to the wrong ears. And when we got to the river's edge, we saw what we were actually dealing with. Nobody talks enough about how bad the Delaware was that night. You see the famous painting, Washington standing heroically in the bow of a boat, men rowing calmly, a few ice chunks visible in the water. It looks dramatic, but manageable. It looks like something you could do. That painting lies. The Delaware that night was a nightmare. The temperature had dropped sharply as the sun went down, and the river, which had already been running with ice chunks for days, was now a churning mess of ice floes, some of them substantial, not a solid sheet you could walk across. Moving chunks, some the size of tables, some much larger, grinding against each other, shifting, unpredictable. The current was strong from recent rains. The wind was cutting and getting worse. And it was dark, genuinely dark, the kind of dark you forget exists if you've spent your whole life around modern lighting. Cloud cover meant no moon, no stars. You could see the river mainly because the ice chunks were slightly lighter than the black water. The boats we had were Durham boats, big, flat-bottomed cargo boats designed for hauling iron and grain up and down the river. They were solid and fairly stable, but they weren't warships. They weren't designed for this. Each one could carry maybe 40 men, or a couple of horses, or one of the cannons, and they had to make multiple trips. The men operating those boats were the Marblehead Mariners, a regiment of sailors and fishermen from Massachusetts, commanded by Colonel John Glover. These men had already saved the army once, getting us off Long Island back in August when we were nearly trapped. Now they were being asked to do something arguably harder. I watched them work and I felt something complicated. Gratitude, respect, a kind of awe. They were calm in a way that seemed almost inhuman given what they were dealing with. Using long poles to push ice away, rowing hard against the current, navigating by memory and instinct in near total darkness. Back and forth, back and forth. The crossing was supposed to start at dark and be completed by midnight. That was the plan. The reality was very different. Here's something the history books gloss over. Most of that night, most of us were just waiting to get on a boat, waiting for the boats to come back. Standing in the wind on the Pennsylvania side of the river while the crossing slowly progressed. And it was cold, not just uncomfortable cold. The kind of cold that gets inside you, that makes your thoughts sluggish, that makes simple tasks feel impossible. Men were stamping their feet, slapping their arms against their sides, huddling together for warmth. Some men had decent coats. Many didn't. The rags wrapped around feet were already soaked and freezing. I remember thinking, standing there waiting, that the cold felt personal, like it was specifically targeting you, like the wind knew exactly where your collar didn't quite close and drove straight for that spot. When it started to snow, and then sleet, it got worse. The sleet in particular was vicious, sharp and stinging against any exposed skin. You'd turn your face away from the wind, and the sleet would find a new angle. There was no winning against it. The horses hated it. The artillery horses were difficult to manage even in good conditions. That night they were spooked and jumpy, and moving them on to and off the boats required multiple men and a great deal of patience that nobody really had to spare. Somewhere in all of this, word filtered back that one of the other crossing groups, downriver, supposed to be cutting off the southern escape route, had turned back. The conditions were simply too bad. The ice was too thick where they were. It couldn't be done. So part of the plan was already broken before the main force had even finished crossing, and the schedule was shredding. Midnight came and went. The crossing wasn't done. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The sky was starting to carry that gray quality that means dawn is coming. Still hours away, but coming, and we still had miles to march after the river. If we didn't move fast enough, we'd be attacking in full daylight. If the Hessians had any warning at all, we'd be walking into a prepared defense with exhausted, cold, disorganized men against professional soldiers. Everything was going wrong. And then I saw him. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make this into mythology. But I also want to tell you what I actually observed. Washington was at the crossing point. He was there for most of the night. Not back at headquarters, not safe and warm somewhere, but there, at the river, in the sleet, watching the crossing, talking to officers, being visible to the men. He was on horseback for much of it, which gave him height and visibility in the darkness. And when men were struggling, with equipment, with the cold, with the boats, he was there. Not yelling, not threatening, just present. There's a specific moment I remember. A group of men were struggling to get one of the cannons onto a boat. The cannon was heavy, the ramp was icy, the horses were fighting the whole operation. Everything was going sideways and it was taking forever. Washington rode over, spoke to the men working the horses, said something. I couldn't hear what. And the whole operation seemed to settle. They got the cannon loaded. I don't know what he said. Maybe it was perfectly practical and tactical, but the effect was real. Seeing him there, dealing with the same cold and sleet as everyone else, doing the work, it mattered. I also noticed something about how the men around me responded to his presence. The complaining didn't stop. The cold didn't stop, but something else. A kind of low-level hopelessness, a feeling of what's the point, seemed to recede a little when he was nearby. People stood up straighter, worked faster, not because they were scared of him, but because he made the thing feel possible. That's a rare quality in a leader, and it's not really something you can fake, not in those conditions. By around 3 in the morning, the crossing was done. All 2,400 men, all 18 cannons, all the horses, all the equipment, across the Delaware and on the New Jersey side. 3 hours behind schedule, in a blizzard, without losing a single man to the river. The Marblehead men deserve more credit than they usually get for that night. What they pulled off was genuinely extraordinary. Now came the march. 9 miles, in the dark, in a blizzard, after standing in the cold for hours. The route took us along the river road and then inland toward Trenton. The plan was to arrive around dawn, split into 2 columns, one commanded by Washington, one by General Sullivan, and hit the town from 2 directions simultaneously. The march was miserable. I'm not going to pretty it up. The road was icy in places and muddy in others. Your feet went from frozen to soaked and then froze again. Men were falling out of the column to rest and being pushed back into it. There was a persistent temptation to just sit down, just for a moment, that you had to actively fight because sitting down in that cold, in that wet, meant you might not get back up. There were men without shoes. I keep coming back to this because it's hard to fully convey. Imagine marching 9 miles on frozen, icy roads with only rags or bare feet. Some of those men did exactly that. They left blood in the snow, not metaphorically, literally, blood from cut and frozen feet leaving marks on the road. Washington rode among the columns, moving back and forth, keeping the men moving. At one point, word came back through the ranks. Some of the men in Sullivan's column had wet powder. Their muskets might not fire. A potentially catastrophic problem. The message came back to Washington, and his response, which got passed back down the line, use the bayonet. If the muskets don't fire, use the bayonet. We're not turning back. That message did something interesting to the mood of the march. It removed a certain category of worry. We weren't going to fail because of wet powder. We weren't going to get to Trenton and then be told to go home because conditions were imperfect. We were going, period. There's a clarity that comes with the removal of options. When you genuinely cannot turn back, you stop spending mental energy on the question of whether you should. About halfway through the march, one of the officers, I believe it was General Greene, rode along the column telling men to keep moving, not to fall out. He said something like, "What you do tonight will either secure your country's freedom or lose it entirely." I'm paraphrasing from memory, and memories from that kind of night are impressionistic at best. But that was the substance of it. I remember thinking, that's either the most terrifying thing I've ever heard or the most motivating. And then deciding, somewhere in the cold and the dark, that it was the latter. What else could you do? Dawn was starting to suggest itself on the horizon, a lightening of the dark, not yet visible light, but a change in quality, when the first buildings of Trenton came into view. The battle itself was surprisingly short. After everything, the weeks of retreat, the night of cold and waiting, the miserable march, the actual fighting was over in roughly 45 minutes, maybe less. The approach to town went better than anyone had reason to expect. There were Hessian pickets posted on the roads, and they were alerted. They knew something was coming, at least vaguely, because there had been some skirmishing in the area in recent days. But they weren't prepared for what was actually coming at them. When they saw the size of the column emerging from the dark and snow, they fell back into town to raise the alarm. Washington's column came in from the north. Sullivan's came in from the west. Both hit the town almost simultaneously, which was the plan working exactly as intended despite everything. Henry Knox got the artillery set up at the top of the main streets, King Street and Queen Street running roughly parallel through the center of town, before the Hessians could organize properly. This was absolutely critical. Those 18 cannons that we'd worked so hard to get across the river and drag through the snow, They now commanded the main avenues of the town. Grape shot down those streets was devastating. The Hessians were not drunk. I want to address this because it's become part of the popular mythology. That they were all asleep, hung over from Christmas celebrations, caught completely unaware. It's more complicated than that. Some accounts suggest they had actually been on heightened alert because of the recent skirmishing. Colonel Roll had received a note warning him of Washington's movement, but had never actually read it. It was found in his pocket after the battle. They were surprised, yes. But they were also professional soldiers, and they reacted with discipline. They tried to form up in the streets, tried to get their own artillery into position. For a few minutes it was genuinely chaotic, and the outcome wasn't certain. But the artillery at the top of the streets was decisive. The Hessians couldn't organize under that fire. They tried to escape through the south of the town toward the Assunpink Creek, but Sullivan's men were there. They tried to regroup in an apple orchard east of town and counterattack, but they were caught in a crossfire. Rall was shot, wounded mortally. Without his leadership, the resistance collapsed. The whole thing was over. Around 900 Hessians taken prisoner, around 22 killed and 83 wounded by various accounts. And the Continental Army. Nobody died in the battle itself. A handful wounded. The casualties from the night, from the cold, from exposure, are harder to count and more painful to think about. You hear people describe combat as a blur, and that's true in a way. But what I remember more vividly than the fighting itself is the silence after. When the shooting stopped, when it was clear the Hessians were surrendering, when the noise and chaos and smoke and shouting all fell away, and you could hear the wind again. I remember standing in the street, King Street, I think, or just off it, and just looking around, at the buildings, at the prisoners being organized, at the men around me who were still alive, who had made it through the night and made it through the battle. There was exhaustion so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing you into the ground. There was relief that was almost pain. And then, gradually, there was something else. Something that took a few minutes to identify. It was pride. Not the loud, shouting kind. The quiet kind, the kind that sits in your chest and makes it harder to breathe for a moment. The feeling of having done something that you weren't sure you could do. Something that, honestly, most reasonable people would have said couldn't be done. I looked at the man next to me. I didn't know his name. We'd never spoken. He was just one of the 2,400. And he was looking at me with this expression. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We both understood exactly what had just happened and what it meant. We'd crossed the Delaware. We'd marched through a blizzard. We'd fought when we had every reason not to, and we'd won. And the war wasn't over. Not even close. But it wasn't over in the other direction either. The thing that had been ending, the thing that everyone had been quietly watching die for weeks, was breathing again. The Hessians deserve a moment of thought here, because they're often either vilified or ignored in the popular telling. These were professional soldiers who had been hired out by their German princes to fight a war on behalf of Britain. Most of them had very little say in the matter. Some of them were actually from areas of Germany that had traditions of sending soldiers abroad for pay. It was an economic reality of the time. They weren't monsters. They were men doing a job in a foreign country for reasons largely outside their control. They were terrified when they surrendered. You could see it. They expected, I think, to be treated roughly. The rules of war at the time didn't guarantee much, and here they were, surrendering to the ragged, disorganized army they'd been hearing about for months. This rebel force that supposedly barely existed anymore. Washington's orders were clear. The prisoners were to be treated humanely. No looting, no abuse, no revenge for the depredations the Hessians had committed in New Jersey, which had been real, and which many of the men around me had personal reasons to be angry about. I watched men who had every reason for anger follow those orders. Not perfectly, not without incident. The temptation was there and visible. But the general conduct was disciplined. The prisoners were moved, were given water, were organized for the march back to the river. It said something about the army that day, about the kind of war Washington was trying to fight. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. The British and Hessian forces had treated New Jersey civilians badly. Looting, burning, worse. Washington was deliberately fighting differently, deliberately building a different kind of army and a different kind of legitimacy. It wasn't just morality, though it was that too. It was strategy. Every humane treatment of prisoners was a signal to the watching world. To France, to Spain, to the American civilians who weren't sure which side to support. About what kind of nation this might become. Then, we had to get everyone, 2,400 Americans, plus nearly 900 prisoners, plus all the equipment, back across the river. In the daylight now, which was better in one sense and worse in another, you could see what you were doing. You could also see how much there was to do and how exhausted everyone was. The Marblehead men went back to their boats. The Delaware crossing going back was harrowing in different ways than the crossing coming. The ice was worse during the day in some stretches, the warming slightly loosening things, creating different hazards. The prisoners had to be managed. The horses were still difficult. Everyone was running on empty. But it got done. Everything and everyone made it back across. Washington had apparently considered staying in New Jersey and pushing further. There was a brief discussion of whether to exploit the victory immediately. But his officers talked him out of it. The men were finished, physically done. Pushing them further that day would have broken them. The army made it back to Pennsylvania with prisoners, with captured supplies, including desperately needed weapons and ammunition, and with something that couldn't be quantified but might have been more important than all of it. A story, a victory, proof. The effect of Trenton rippled outward fast. The news traveled quickly for 1776. Within days, people across the colonies knew. The Continental Army, the army everyone had been writing off, the army whose death had seemed like a matter of paperwork and time, had crossed the Delaware in a blizzard on Christmas night and beaten a professional garrison. The tone of the war shifted. Not the military situation, not yet. That would require more battles, more months, more suffering, but the psychological and political atmosphere changed noticeably. Men whose enlistments were expiring reconsidered. Washington, at a crucial moment right after Trenton, addressed his men directly. Asked them to stay for 6 more weeks, just 6 more weeks, for a bounty of $10. He asked them twice because the first ask was met with silence. And then, gradually, men started stepping forward. Not all of them. Some went home anyway, but enough stayed. Enough to keep the army alive. Enough to fight the next battle at Princeton a week later, which was another continental victory. The French were watching. They'd been cautiously interested in supporting the American cause, mostly because it was against Britain, their great rival. But they needed to believe the revolution might actually succeed before they'd commit resources. Trenton was a data point, not decisive on its own, but part of an accumulating argument. Thomas Paine's American Crisis was being read everywhere. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. People who had been wavering were being asked directly which kind of soldier they were going to be. And across New Jersey, something else happened. The Hessian and British garrisons, which had been moving through the state with relative confidence, treating it as essentially conquered territory, suddenly became cautious, nervous. The post at Trenton was gone. Which posts were next? The calculus of occupation shifted. Here's something worth sitting with. The American Revolution, from a purely military standpoint, should not have succeeded. The British Empire, at its 1776 peak, was the most powerful military force on Earth. Professional army, the greatest navy in the world, virtually unlimited resources compared to the Continental Congress, which was perpetually broke, perpetually struggling to supply its own army. And yet the revolution did succeed. How? Part of it was distance. Britain was operating 3,000 miles from home, and every reinforcement, every supply shipment had to survive that crossing. Part of it was politics. The British government was divided on the war. Public opinion in Britain was complicated. There were people in Parliament who didn't want to beat the colonists into submission. Part of it was eventually France coming in, which changed the strategic balance fundamentally. But part of it, a real significant part, was December 26th, 1776. A night and morning when the revolution could very easily have ended in exhaustion and cold and simple administrative expiration of enlistments, and instead ended with 900 prisoners and a town liberated and men deciding to stay for 6 more weeks. Momentum is real in warfare. Morale is real. The will to continue fighting is not just a soft, unquantifiable thing. It's as strategic as territory or weapons. Washington understood this. The crossing of the Delaware was not primarily a military operation designed to destroy a garrison. It was primarily a psychological operation designed to change what people believed was possible. It worked. I want to take a moment to talk about the people in this story who don't usually get named. The Marblehead Mariners. They don't get a famous painting. Their commander, John Glover, has a statue and some recognition among history enthusiasts, but he's not a household name. These men saved the Continental Army twice, at Long Island in August and at the Delaware in December, through sheer competence and toughness. Without them, the crossing doesn't happen. Full stop. The men without shoes. I keep returning to this image. We know from the historical record that men left bloody footprints in the snow on that march to Trenton. We don't know most of their names. They were farmers, tradesmen, hired men, free black soldiers. Yes, black soldiers fought that night. The Continental Army was not as segregated as later American armies. Young men who had signed up for an idea and were now paying for it literally in blood from frozen feet. Henry Knox, 26 years old at the time of Trenton. A former Boston bookseller who had taught himself artillery from books, who had hauled cannons from Fort Ticonderoga across the Berkshires the previous winter, 300 miles in winter, an accomplishment so audacious it seems fictional, and who set up those 18 guns at the top of the streets in Trenton with exactly the right tactical eye. Without Knox's artillery, the battle might not have been the swift, clean victory it was. The men who turned back, the 2 other crossing groups who attempted their parts of the operation and couldn't do it. The ice was too thick, conditions too bad. History doesn't usually celebrate them because history celebrates success. But they tried. They were there on Christmas night on the banks of the Delaware, attempting something terrifying and impossible in conditions that were objectively worse than where Washington's group was crossing. Their failure wasn't a character flaw. It was an honest response to an impossible situation, and even the Hessians. Colonel Roll, who died of his wounds after the battle, had reportedly asked that his prisoners be treated well. A man who'd spent his military career in European warfare, fighting by European rules, suddenly transplanted to this strange colonial conflict. He made mistakes that night, didn't read the warning note, was slow to respond. But he also fought with what he had. His men fought professionally until they couldn't anymore. History is full of people who did remarkable things without being remembered for them. That night was no different. I've been careful throughout this account not to mythologize Washington, because mythology actually makes him less interesting, not more. The real Washington was complicated. He was a slaveholder. This is not a footnote. It's a fundamental fact about the man that can't be separated from who he was. He was sometimes vain, sometimes thin-skinned, capable of being wrong and being stubborn about it. He lost more battles than he won. He was not infallible, but he had something that the revolution needed at this particular moment, something that is genuinely hard to identify and describe, but that you felt in his presence, a quality of steadiness, of not breaking. The weeks before Christmas 1776 were the low point. Not just militarily. The retreat, the losses, the shrinking army. But personally for Washington, the weight of it must have been extraordinary. He was writing letters to the Continental Congress that were increasingly urgent, increasingly desperate. He knew what was happening. He saw the enlistments expiring, saw the men leaving, understood that the thing he was in charge of was dissolving. And he did not break. He kept thinking. He kept planning. He kept showing up at the river in the dark, in the sleet, being visible to his men, making the crossing feel possible. That steadiness, that refusal to accept the ending that everyone could see coming, is what the Delaware crossing ultimately was. It was Washington refusing to let the revolution die of exhaustion and cold and paperwork. Refusing in a very active, specific, militarily clever way. Was he afraid? I believe he was. He'd have to be human and to understand what he was asking of himself and his men. But fear and action aren't mutually exclusive. You can be afraid and still be the person who steps forward. Sometimes that's the most you can ask of anyone. Why does this story matter? Not as history, or not only as history, but as something that has relevance beyond 1776. I think about that night sometimes in terms of what it takes to continue when continuation seems unreasonable, when the rational calculation suggests stopping, when everyone around you, including many smart and thoughtful people, agrees that it's over. The Continental Army in December 1776 had every logical reason to conclude the war was lost. The evidence pointed that direction. And yet a group of people, cold and exhausted and frightened, got in boats on a frozen river in a blizzard and crossed to the other side. This is not a story about recklessness. Washington thought carefully about the risks, weighed the options, made a plan. It's not a story about blind faith either. He had specific tactical reasons to believe the operation could succeed. It's a story about what happens when you refuse to accept the narrative of inevitable failure. When you look at a situation that looks finished and ask, is there actually one more move? Is there something that, if we did it, would change what everyone believes is possible? Sometimes there is. Sometimes the situation that looks finished isn't actually finished. Sometimes the crossing that looks impossible can be made. The 9 miles you march after the crossing, wet and cold and exhausted, with cannons in the dark, those matter too. The victory doesn't happen without the willingness to do the grinding, painful, unglamorous work after the dramatic moment of crossing. A lot of the stories we tell about this period focus on the dramatic moments. The crossing, the painting, the surprise at dawn. But the real work was in the weeks and months on either side of that night. The retreating without completely falling apart. The recruiting and keeping the army alive. The planning. And then, after Trenton, doing it again and again and again until the war was actually won. I should talk about the painting because you've seen it. Emanuel Leutzer painted Washington crossing the Delaware in 1851, 75 years after the event in Düsseldorf, Germany, based on models who were nothing like the actual soldiers, using the Rhine River as a reference for the Delaware. It's magnificent, and it's almost entirely wrong about the physical details. Washington is standing in the bow of a boat. Nobody stands in the bow of a Durham boat navigating ice floes in the dark. You'd go into the river. The boats are too small and too few. The ice looks wrong. The light is wrong. It shows a grey dawn sky, but the crossing was done in full dark. The men are too tidy, too composed, too portrait-like. And yet the painting captures something true about that night. The forward momentum, the cold and the difficulty made visible in the faces and the posture, the sense of people doing something they aren't entirely sure they can do. Washington's posture, upright, looking forward, not away. That's right. That's accurate to what I've been trying to describe. Art doesn't have to be documentary to be truthful. The feeling of that crossing, the atmosphere, the something hanging in the balance quality of the night. The painting gets that. It got it enough that for 150 years people have looked at it and felt what they're supposed to feel, which is probably why it's still one of the most recognized images in American history. There's one detail about that night that I want to end on because I think it captures something important. Before the crossing began, Washington had a password distributed through the ranks. If you were challenged in the dark, at the river, on the march near Trenton, you needed the password to identify yourself as friendly. The password was victory or death. Not a typical operational security choice. Passwords are usually random, unmemorable words chosen specifically because they're hard to guess. Victory or death is not that kind of password. It's a statement, a declaration, something you'd say aloud in the dark to another cold and frightened soldier and feel the weight of victory or death. Those were the options. No middle ground. No, we tried, but conditions were too difficult. No, we'll attempt this again when the weather improves. You crossed the river, you marched the miles, you fought the battle, or you didn't. And if you didn't, the revolution was dying either way. When I think about that password, victory or death, being whispered in the dark along the banks of the Delaware and then along a frozen road in New Jersey, I think about all the men who said it. Farmers and dock workers and tradesmen and fishermen and freed slaves and young men with no shoes, saying it to each other in the dark, meaning it. That's the crossing, not the painting, not the mythology, not the clean version. That moment, that password, those men in the dark, choosing victory or death, and then taking the next step. Before we close, let me leave you with some specifics, because numbers sometimes make the human reality more concrete. The temperature that night was estimated between 20 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, right around freezing, with wind chill making it significantly worse. The sleet and snow that fell during the crossing and march was documented by multiple participants. The crossing took approximately 3 hours longer than planned. It was completed around 3 a.m. instead of midnight. The march to Trenton was 9 miles. The men arrived at approximately 7:30 to 8 a.m., about 45 minutes to an hour after dawn. The battle lasted somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and a half, depending on which account you read. Continental casualties in the battle. 0 dead, 5 wounded. Some accounts say 2 soldiers froze to death during the night, though these numbers vary. Hessian casualties. Approximately 22 killed, 83 wounded, 896 captured. Captured supplies included muskets, swords, cannons, ammunition, flags, horses, all desperately needed by the Continental Army. Men who stayed to re-enlist after Washington's speech following the battle. Enough. The exact numbers are debated. But enough. The crossing of the Delaware is one of those events that, if you described it to someone beforehand, they would have told you it was impossible. And they wouldn't have been wrong exactly. Everything about it was at or past the edge of what human beings and horses and wooden boats can be asked to endure. It worked because of specific decisions made by specific people. The Marblehead Mariners who knew rivers, Henry Knox who knew artillery, Washington who knew that sometimes the impossible thing is the only remaining option. But it also worked because of thousands of men whose names we don't know, who had every reason to stop and didn't, who wrapped rags around their feet and got in line and kept walking in the dark. History has a way of compressing time until turning points look inevitable. The American Revolution succeeded, so it must have been going to succeed. The crossing worked, so it was always going to work. Hindsight smooths over. The nights when it genuinely looked like it wouldn't. I was there on that night, in this telling. And I want you to understand. It didn't feel inevitable. It felt desperate and cold and uncertain, right up until the moment it wasn't. The reason it worked is that people acted anyway. in the uncertainty, in the cold, across the ice. That's the real story of the crossing of the Delaware. If you found this account interesting, there's so much more to explore in this period. The week after Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, the following winter at Valley Forge, which was in some ways even harder than this night. If you want to go deeper on any of those, let me know in the comments. I'd love to take you through those stories the same way. And if you've made it this far, thank you for spending this time with history. These stories matter, not as mythology, not as simple inspiration, but as honest accounts of what human beings are actually capable of when they decide not to stop. See you next time.